one of the first things we started was putting things in context of time. So I want to continue that first. And up here we talked about the first decade of Christianity being from 30 to 40 approximately. More specifically, starting with Pentecost, Stephen. I'm going to get these kind of in order. They're not necessarily exactly in order, but about this structure. Pentecost, Stephen. We've heard Stephen's story. So Stephen gets martyred. Philip is the first evangelist that goes out into Samaria and to Judea, the smallest area. We're going to skip forward past this, but we're going to come back to Saul. Then we have the conversion of Saul, Barnabas, who we're going to hear from today, Cornelius, and that is about the end of the first decade, 10 years. Okay, so Barnabas and Saul start kind of in the early part of that 10 years, go all the way through, and in the second decade, as we will see, you have the famine in Jerusalem that causes Paul to bring an offering to Jerusalem, and then you have the first missionary journey, and that ends, or the first missionary journey is in the late 40s, so it's toward the end of the second decade. So we're talking about a long span of time, a lot longer than most people perceive. Okay, almost 20 years from Pentecost until the end of the first missionary journey, and that's going to be an important time. So in context, the story we're going to hear today is going to happen from early in the first decade to the end of the second decade. Okay, long period of time, a lot longer, like I said, than most people perceive. Geographically, we're going to talk about that context. So look at your map. And some of the places we're going to talk about today are Cyprus on the left. So you see the island of Cyprus. We're going to talk about Antioch. Antioch is in the center upper right side. Do you see Antioch? If you don't see Antioch, raise your hand. Somebody else help you. That's up where it says disciples first called Christians. That's the little heading. That's Antioch. That's the Antioch in Syria. Okay, so that's where we're going to put our. We'll also be spending time in Jerusalem. So drop all the way down to the center toward the bottom. There's Jerusalem. And then the other place we're going to talk about a little bit today is Damascus. Damascus is in the lower center. Everybody see Damascus? So this is we're covering a fairly wide geographic area. So Damascus is in Syria, Antioch's in Syria, Jerusalem, of course, is in Israel. Cyprus is its own little country island. So a lot of movement geographically. The last thing I want to put in context before we move is something that I hadn't considered. When I grew up and all the time that I've studied Acts, I've always thought as Paul being the most important person in Acts. The most important character in Acts was Paul. So Paul's here. The next most important person is somewhere way down here. That's how I've always perceived it. I have a totally different view now of the importance of the characters in Acts. So who is the most important character in Acts?
Holy Spirit.
Holy Spirit. Excellent. Good answer. Holy Spirit is here. Okay. Paul is kind of here. Who's third? Who's probably the third most important character? Another P name. Peter. Peter is probably the next most important person in Acts. He's somewhere below Paul. Who would you say is the next most important character in Acts? Not fairly far below Paul, but not that far below Peter. And I'm going to maintain it's a tie. I'm saying a tie for fourth place is James and the person we're going to hear from today. So the person we're hearing from today is played by Brett White, and it's Barnabas. And I think you'll be surprised at how important Barnabas is in the play. So if everybody clap their hands, I think that's going to be his signal to come out.
been nervous teaching before, but not like this.
Click on your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Barnabas. I've done some unthinkable things in my life, and I'm sure you have too. Things that you would never think that you would do. I want to do more unthinkable things in my life. All you have to do is change the way you think. Let me explain to you. To be a Jew like me, it was unthinkable to sell your land. Your land was how you made a living. It was how you fed your family. To sell it was unheard of. It was land that my ancestors were buried on. Land that I would probably be buried on too. As a matter of fact, the custom was that the land would go back to its original owners in the Jubilee year. So to sell my land as a Jew was unthinkable. That was before I met Peter. Before I saw Peter heal a crippled man. Or before I saw Peter preach. Before I became baptized. Before I became a believer in Jesus Christ. Before I received the Holy Spirit. To me, to sell the land of my ancestors, that's exactly what I did. When the Holy Spirit led me to sell my land, I sold it. I took the full amount of the sales price and gave it to the apostles. I tried to do it discreetly, just as Jesus had commanded, but they wanted to make a big deal of it, to let others know, to encourage other people. I think most of the people were encouraged, although I do believe some of them acted jealously and inappropriately. That was the first lesson in me completely obeying the Holy Spirit and acting in total faith, working through the Holy Spirit. Can you think of anyone else that had money that withheld from the Holy Spirit? Ananias and Sapphira. They withheld. The Holy Spirit punished them, as Peter has already told you. It was the sale of the land that earned me my nickname. You see, my real name is Joseph. The apostles nicknamed me Barnabas. Barnabas means son of encouragement. The nickname stuck after the land sale. As a matter of fact, later in my life, some people even started to call me an apostle, which really encouraged me as well. Even though I was an integral part of the early growth of the church in Jerusalem, I was always a bit of an outsider. You see, I'm from the island of Cyprus. I'm not a Jerusalem insider. As you'll hear in the story, this is really, really important. Little did I know that my knowledge of the cities around the world was going to be an integral part of the growth of the church. Also, my desire to encourage people would cause me to do more unthinkable things. Just as you saw on your maps, there are some places that I know very well. Of course, my hometown and island of Cyprus, Antioch, Caesarea, Jerusalem, Damascus. In an upcoming story, you'll find how important some of these cities are because of their locale. Very important in their trading routes. One day I got a message from my dear friend Ananias of Damascus. He had been led by the Holy Spirit to affirm to me about the conversion of Saul. Conversion of Saul. As you know, that caught me off guard. Ananias confirmed to me that Saul was now preaching the gospel in a very powerful way. Ananias begged me not to only accept and to encourage Paul, but to do so for others as well. He told me that the reasons the Holy Spirit had given me authority, had given me a reputation and the character that I have, was for a time just as this. To be a voucher for Saul. It was only later that I learned that Ananias may have had an ulterior motive for wanting Saul, to leave Damascus. At this point, I want to ask for a little grace. For the rest of the story, I want to use Saul's Roman name, Paul, for the rest of the story. Can anybody tell me what Saul's Jewish name is?
Saul.
Saul. The Jews, he was known as Saul. The Romans, the Gentile, he was known as Paul. Anyway, I did the unthinkable again. I vouched for a man who had previously killed and murdered, imprisoned, tortured my brothers and sisters in our church. I'm vouching for a man that we were all afraid of. Frankly, I used up all the points and influence I had accrued, but it turned out to be a small price to pay. I believe that Paul's short time in Jerusalem was a big part of launching him as the greatest preacher and defender of the gospel. That short time in Jerusalem built the foundation for my relationship with the man that I would travel and preach with for so many years. Unfortunately, Paul offended so many people in Jerusalem that they threatened to kill him. We had to rush him off to Caesarea and then to his hometown of Tarsus. Do you know the Holy Spirit promised me that I would be a child of God? He said, Barnabas, you know that peacemakers are going to be called children of God. Your job is to make peace for Paul as much as possible, and I promise you, you will have plenty of opportunity to do so. Because if you can imagine, as abrasive as Paul was before he was converted, he was the same after he was converted. He offended a lot of people. He was very, very educated. So we rushed off to Caesarea, then to his hometown of Tarsus. The Holy Spirit confirmed to me that Paul was a piece of work. He was stronger than garlic. But he was convinced. And the Holy Spirit was going to use him as his instrument for the Gentiles. From the very first day I started making peace for Paul, and I never finished doing so, it was like he used to make caustic remarks because he was brilliant, he was educated. Whenever I tried to calm him down, he would look at me and say, Barnabas, Barnabas, don't be a little thorn in my flesh. These people need to hear the truth. If it hadn't been for me, Paul would have been flogged and jailed many, many more times than he already was. My career as Paul's peacemaker started simply enough. We Christians in Jerusalem started hearing the success of the scattered Jewish Christians that they were having sharing the gospel. Some of them from my own hometown of Cyprus had gone to Antioch to share the word with the Gentiles and were building a flourishing church. Even though Peter had already convinced us it was time to convert Gentiles, we Jewish Christians were still wary. We just didn't know. So my friends in Jerusalem sent me to find out what was going on. Fortunately, the Lord was blessing the church tremendously in Antioch. So I just pitched in and helped grow the church. The church in Antioch was the first place that we believers were called what? Christians. The very first place, the church in Antioch. It was also the first church that had Gentile influence. The other major church was the church in Jerusalem. We early Christians, we had several names. Some of them we can't repeat. There were other names they called us. Can you think of any?
The Way.
The Way. Little Christ. Christ's people. The Way. That was popular because the first Roman highway was called the Appian Way. So it was common for Romans to call us something that they could relate to. And of course, another name that we were called is from Jesus' hometown, the Nazarenes. So let me take a moment and tell you about Antioch. Big city. There are at least 16 cities with the name of Antioch. They were named after Antiochus, the son of one successor to Alexander the Great. This Antioch that we are talking about was also known as Assyrian Antioch or Antioch on the Orontes. It was one of the great cities of the Roman Empire in my time. So it was just called Antioch, while all the other cities were designated with other names. This city is located in Turkey, and it's about 300 miles from Jerusalem. I and some of my friends from Cyprus helped establish the church in Antioch. For many decades, the church in Antioch was second only to the church in Jerusalem. It played a major role in sending out missionaries. And what else would you think? Major role in the church in Antioch. Missionaries and church doctrine. I hope you pay a lot of attention to it as we go along. Antioch was a very, very important part of the Christians' understanding that Christ was going to grow his kingdom through his church. The Greek word for church is ekklesia, which means assembly. Antioch was the first place that proved an assembly of believers were a community of those who trust in Jesus Christ and gather to express their beliefs without regard. This is important. Without regard to whether you were Jewish or Gentiles. Very important. It was the cradle of Gentile Christianity. Here's the crazy part. The church community is supposed to reflect the community that is found among the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It is to reflect God's divine nature. They, the Trinity, planned the church in eternity past. And we got to see it come into existence. We didn't know what was happening. We just knew that we had found Jesus. And we believed. It wasn't later till we knew that that was the vehicle by by which he was going to go, was his church. One last thing about Antioch. When Paul stayed there, he stayed in the house of Simon and his two sons, Rufus and Alexander. Simon was from Libya, a town in northern Africa. He did something really, really monumental that we will all remember him for. Does anybody know what that is? Carried the cross of Jesus. He later became a leader in the church at Antioch. You can only imagine the conversations that Simon and Paul had about the early church. One day the Spirit says to me, Barnabas, why don't you go find Paul in his hometown of Tarsus? It's only about a 125-mile walk. Only take you a week or two to get there. And it's so lovely this time of year. I'm following the Spirit. So I go. And when I get there, it's not hard to find Paul. He's teaching and preaching and causing havoc, as you know. The believers in Tarsus were more than happy for me to take Paul back to Antioch. We stayed in Antioch for over a year. And Paul matured. He learned a little bit about how to preach in such a way that would both inform people and encourage people. But you guessed it, after a year, the believers in Antioch thought it was a good idea for Paul and me to take a contribution back to the church in Jerusalem because they were suffering from famine. So here we go, on the road again. I'm not questioning their pure hearts about wanting to help the church in Jerusalem, but they make the contribution big enough that Paul and I felt compelled to leave. And while I'm not belittling their gratefulness for the contribution, it wasn't very long before the church at Jerusalem concluded we had finished our mission work there as well. And they sent us back to Antioch. Paul still had some pretty sharp edges and could wear out a welcome pretty quickly. This happened again in Antioch in only a few months. So with the approval of the Holy Spirit in the church at Antioch, they decided that Paul and I should set out on a long missionary journey, which they were more than happy to fund. I would never question my friends and brothers and sisters at Antioch, but their laying on of hands of us felt every bit like a push. Probably my biggest job of peacekeeping had to do with Peter and Paul. While neither of them was concerned about being the top apostle, they knew that Jesus Christ was at the top. And they were his slaves. But they fought like brothers. Peter would see it one way. Paul would see it another. And on and on and on. And they had no problem fighting it out. Finally, they figured out Paul should be concerned with the Gentiles and Peter with the Jews. After this, things went much, much smoother. Even so, at the end of Peter's life, he couldn't help but give Paul a little love tap. He wrote, Paul's letters contain some things that are hard to understand. What he meant was, Paul, I love you, but you are making it hard for the rest of us. You you are so smart. Make it easy. Festus agreed and said, your great learning is driving you crazy, and me too. I mentioned that Peter and Paul didn't contend for importance, but I should throw myself in that conversation in that regard as well. From the very beginning, I was held in much higher importance, a much higher standard than Paul. In fact, I was called an apostle. Even Dr. Luke acknowledges that in his writings by mentioning my name first. And then that changed about halfway through our first missionary journey. My apprentice became the master. Paul took the lead, and I became his apprentice. The son of encouragement, becoming an apprentice in the church. It was a bittersweet moment for me. I'm going to stop my story here. In upcoming weeks, you'll hear about the first missionary journey and some of the very interesting things that happened to us. As you hear that story, remember why we get to be named child of God and why Paul and I never stayed in one place very long. So there's 3 or 4 things I want you to remember about me. I was chosen. I was chosen by the Holy Spirit. My name is Joseph, but you know me as Barnabas. Barnabas means son of encouragement. Remember, Paul was my understudy. He was my apprentice till the first missionary journey. And then last, remember that I was on the first missionary journey as well. And I'll leave you with this. Paul and I, we left for Antioch. We left for Jerusalem. We left for Tarsus. We left for Antioch. We left. We were always on the move. Thank you guys for your time this morning.
So did your opinion of Barnabas change a little bit there? Did you ever think about that? And that wasn't a short time that Paul was Barnabas' apprentice. Back to the timeline. He may have been Barnabas' apprentice for 15 years. Long time. That's a whole different view of Barnabas that I have now than I had before. So let's go back through the lesson a little bit before we get to prayer time. I'm going to make sure how much time we have. Not much. Why didn't, remember, Barnabas sold his land. To us, when we read that first story, that's not a big deal. What you learn from the story today? Big deal. It was a big deal. For Jews to sell their land was a huge deal. Why was Barnabas an outsider? Do you remember? Why was Barnabas an outsider to the Jerusalem Jews? He was from Cyprus, right? So he was away. And then I want to end. We talked about Antioch enough. I'm going to leave it there. But this is a thought that our fearless leader Mitch Wilburn gave me this week that I had never thought of before. The Christians were first called Christians at Antioch. Okay, we've all got the importance of Antioch in that. When they were first called Christians, was that a mark of approval or a derogatory term? Have you ever thought about that? Could have been equally as much a derogatory term as a favorable term. And that was startling to me when Mitch brought that up. I'd never thought about it. I always thought Christians, yeah, we're Christians. How many times is the word Christian used in the Bible? Here's a good trivia question for you that you can find out if you have a phone real quick. The word Christian in the Bible is only in 3 times. One of them is when they're called first Christians at Antioch. One of them is by a Roman official, and it doesn't sound to me like when I reread it that was necessarily a favorable term. The third time is in one of the late letters, I believe it's from Peter, when he talks about being persecuted as a Christian. Again, not necessarily favorable. So it's interesting how words like that if we read them in context of our own situation, we might come away with a different idea than what was really meant early on. Christians were not necessarily highly approved of, as we will begin to see as we're going on. So, anyway, there are a couple of new things for you to consider about Barnabas and his world. So, next week we're going to start with a character that is supposedly or seemingly minor in the book of Acts, but is actually a very major player. So we'll have Brett Organ next week. I think you will learn a lot if you come for that. So let's do prayers, and then we'll end up.